It was a quiet afternoon on a suburban road, the kind where the hum of traffic is barely noticeable. The black CEO, dressed in a tailored suit, drove home after a long day of meetings, his mind on the next presentation. Everything about his demeanor and car, a sleek, understated luxury sedan, spoke of success. Yet, the moment the red and blue lights of a police cruiser flashed behind him, a familiar knot formed in his stomach. For many, a routine traffic stop is just that, routine. But for black men in America, it's a moment fraught with tension, where survival instincts kick in. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over, but the stakes always felt the same. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed to a stop. The officer, tall and broad-shouldered, approached the car with the practiced gait of someone who believed he had authority. He tapped on the window with an air of impatience. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone void of courtesy. The CEO complied without protest, his movements deliberate and visible. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" he inquired, keeping his voice calm. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. I'll ask the questions here," he snapped. His tone dripped with condescension, and it was clear he had already made up his mind about who this man was. In that moment, a thought crossed the CEO's mind. This isn't just about me. It's about every black man who has been here before. Slowly, he reached for his phone, pressing record as discreetly as possible. This scene, sadly, is not unique. Statistics show that black drivers are 20% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers and almost twice as likely to be searched during a stop, despite similar rates of contraband discovery. These disparities highlight the deep-seated biases within law enforcement. In recent years, the proliferation of smartphones and social media has brought such encounters to the forefront of public consciousness. Videos of unjustified stops, arrests, and even violence have sparked outrage and protests, forcing a long-overdue reckoning with systemic racism in policing. The stakes are high. For the CEO, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a moment that could alter his life, or even end it. But this time, the power dynamic was about to shift in a way neither he nor the officer could have anticipated. As this story unfolds, we'll dive deeper into the encounter and its aftermath. What happens when the officer realizes he's being recorded? How does the CEO's decision to document the incident challenge the narrative and hold the system accountable? Most importantly, how does this seemingly ordinary event spark broader conversations about race, privilege, and justice? Stay tuned as we explore the personal, systemic, and societal layers of this incident, revealing both its immediate and far-reaching consequences. The officer leaned closer, scanning the car's interior as though searching for something incriminating. "You were speeding," he said flatly, though the CEO knew this wasn't true. He had been mindful of his speed, especially in this area. "Officer, with respect, I believe I was within the speed limit," the CEO replied, maintaining his composure. The officer's expression hardened. "Are you arguing with me?" he snapped, his voice rising slightly. His hand hovered near his holster, a gesture that wasn't lost on the CEO. Moments like this were where things often escalated. A misplaced word, a wrong move, and the narrative could spiral out of control. The CEO knew this. He had heard the stories, seen the videos, attended the vigils. But he also knew the power of documentation. The recording on his phone was his shield, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. For the CEO, this wasn't just an isolated encounter. It was a microcosm of a larger, persistent issue. The reality of being judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. Despite his tailored suit, luxury car, and polite demeanor, he was reduced in the officer's eyes to a stereotype, a potential threat. This wasn't a news story. Black Americans have long been subjected to racial profiling, a practice rooted in systemic bias. Studies have shown that officers often operate on subconscious biases that associate blackness with criminality, creating a toxic feedback loop where these assumptions justify discriminatory behavior. For the CEO, the irony was bitter. He had worked tirelessly to achieve success, breaking barriers in corporate America where the odds were stacked against him. Yet here he was, facing the same indignities he'd experienced as a young man growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood. His wealth and status offered no immunity. They were invisible to the man with the badge. Racial profiling isn't just an individual failing. It's a systemic one. Policies like stop and frisk and predictive policing disproportionately target communities of color, perpetuating cycles of mistrust and marginalization. Even when confronted with evidence of these disparities, institutions often resist meaningful reform, citing officer discretion as an unassailable defense. But discretion, as this incident illustrated, could be a double-edged sword. It granted officers the power to make judgment calls, but without accountability, those calls often reinforced existing inequities. To understand the issue fully, it's important to consider the officer's perspective. Law enforcement is a profession steeped in tradition, with its own set of pressures and challenges. Officers are trained to be hypervigilant, operating under the assumption that every encounter could pose a threat to their safety. But this culture of suspicion often intersects with implicit bias, creating situations where split-second decisions are influenced by deeply ingrained stereotypes. The officer in this scenario likely didn't see himself as a racist. To him, he was just doing his job, ensuring public safety. Yet his behavior suggested otherwise. His tone, body language, and assumptions about the CEO's intentions painted a clear picture of someone operating under biased perceptions. As the officer demanded the CEO step out of the car, the tension was palpable. The CEO complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The recording continued, capturing every word, every gesture. "What's in the trunk?" the officer asked. "Just some personal items." "You're welcome to check," the CEO replied, though he knew he had the right to refuse. In that moment, he wasn't just thinking about his rights, he was thinking about his life. The officer opened the trunk, rummaging through its contents. He found nothing of interest, but his demeanor remained aggressive. It was as though he was determined to find something, anything, that would justify his actions. The CEO stood silently, his heart pounding. He felt anger, humiliation, and fear, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to. And then, the officer's eyes landed on the phone, which was still recording from its place on the passenger seat. His expression shifted, first to surprise, then to something resembling unease. "Are you recording this?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, officer," the CEO replied evenly. "For my protection." The power dynamic shifted in an instant. The officer's bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He knew the implications of that recording, how it could be used to scrutinize his actions, how it could spark outrage if it revealed misconduct. This wasn't just an interaction between two individuals anymore. It was evidence, a potential catalyst for accountability. The officer straightened, his demeanor now visibly more cautious. The presence of the recording had transformed the dynamic of the encounter. Where before he had exuded confidence, now there was hesitation. "Turn off the recording," the officer demanded, his voice tight. "I'm within my rights to record this interaction, officer," the CEO responded calmly. "It's for transparency, for both of us." The statement carried weight. It wasn't just a defiance of the officer's authority. It was a reminder of accountability. The officer hesitated, then stepped back, perhaps realizing the potential consequences of escalating the situation further. In an era of smartphones and instant sharing, the power of the recorded moment has become a crucial tool in the fight against injustice. Videos of police encounters have sparked movements, shifted public opinion, and forced institutional reforms. But this power cuts both ways. For officers, the possibility of being recorded adds pressure, sometimes causing them to alter their behavior mid-encounter, as in this case. For civilians, recording is a double-edged sword, both a shield against injustice and a potential flashpoint for confrontation. The CEO's decision to record wasn't just a personal act of self-preservation. It was part of a broader movement. He knew that without proof, his story could easily be dismissed or twisted. Later that evening, the video made its way onto social media. It was raw, unfiltered, and damning. Within hours, it began to gain traction, shared by activists, celebrities, and everyday users who recognized its importance. The footage showed the officer's abrupt tone, his baseless search, and the shift in his behavior once he realized he was being recorded. It painted a clear picture of the unequal power dynamic and the pervasive bias at play. The police department, now under public scrutiny, announced an internal review of the incident. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Behind the scenes, the CEO began working with legal advisors and advocacy groups to ensure the investigation wasn't just a formality. He knew the pattern all too well: public outrage, a brief suspension, and then a quiet return to business as usual. He was determined that this time would be different. Accountability isn't about punishment, he explained in an interview. It's about change. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to the next person or the next generation. The incident became more than just a story about one man's experience. It became a lens through which people examined the broader issues of policing and race in America. Debates erupted on news panels and town halls and across social media platforms. Some defended the officer, arguing he was just doing his job and citing the risks law enforcement faces daily. Others pointed out the undeniable pattern of racial bias, demanding systemic reforms to address it. The conversation wasn't easy. It exposed deep divisions and uncomfortable truths, but it also brought attention to solutions: mandatory body cameras, implicit bias training, and independent oversight of police conduct. For the CEO, the experience was transformative. He had always been aware of the challenges faced by Black Americans, but living through such a stark example of racial bias gave him a renewed sense of purpose. "This isn't just about me," he said during a televised interview. "It's about every person who's been treated unfairly because of the way they look. It's about creating a system that serves everyone equally." He began using his platform to advocate for change, partnering with organizations that fought for police reform and racial equity. His story became a rallying cry, inspiring others to share their experiences and demand accountability. As more information emerged, it became clear that this officer had a history of complaints related to racial profiling. Past incidents had been quietly dismissed or settled, with no substantial consequences. This revelation added fuel to the fire. If accountability had been enforced earlier, the CEO's encounter might never have happened. It was a stark reminder of how unchecked behavior perpetuates systemic issues. The department faced mounting pressure to address not just this officer's conduct, but the policies and practices that enabled it. Activists demanded transparency, calling for the release of complaint records and the implementation of oversight mechanisms. Amid the rising tension, the police chief held a press conference acknowledging the need for change. "We recognize the concerns raised by this incident," he said. "We are committed to rebuilding trust and ensuring that our officers uphold the highest standards of professionalism." It was a step forward, but words alone wouldn't suffice. The public wanted action, tangible, measurable change. The CEO, now a central figure in the conversation, attended community meetings, spoke at rallies, and met with lawmakers. He understood that lasting change required sustained effort, collaboration, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. The viral video and subsequent investigation were catalysts for a series of profound changes. What started as one man's fight for accountability quickly evolved into a larger movement for reform within the local police department and beyond. Under the glare of public scrutiny, the city council convened an emergency meeting to address the incident. Activists and community leaders flooded the chamber, demanding comprehensive changes to policing policies. As a direct result of the CEO's case and the public outcry, the following measures were announced. Officers would now be required to wear body cameras during all interactions with civilians. This policy aimed to provide an objective record of encounters and ensure transparency. The department partnered with experts to implement a training program designed to address implicit bias and promote equitable treatment of all citizens. A civilian review board was established to investigate complaints against officers, ensuring accountability outside the internal chain of command. While these changes were welcomed as significant steps forward, they were only the beginning. Advocates emphasized that policies alone wouldn't solve the problem. Cultural shifts within law enforcement and broader societal change were equally critical. The officer involved in the incident faced disciplinary action. After a thorough investigation, he was terminated for violating department protocols and exhibiting behavior unbecoming of his role. His dismissal sent a strong message. Misconduct would no longer be tolerated or swept under the rug. But it also sparked debate. Some argued that firing one officer wasn't enough, calling for systemic accountability across the entire department. The CEO, while satisfied with this outcome, remained focused on the bigger picture. "This isn't just about one bad apple," he said during a press conference. "It's about the tree and the soil it's planted in. If we want real change, we need to address the roots of the problem." The incident and its aftermath sparked a broader conversation about the role of police in society. For many, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the inequities embedded in everyday systems. Communities across the country began organizing workshops, forums, and discussions to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they serve. These initiatives focused on fostering mutual understanding, addressing historical injustices, and envisioning a future where public safety didn't come at the expense of marginalized groups. The CEO played an active role in these efforts. Drawing from his corporate experience, he introduced frameworks for accountability, transparency, and goal-oriented reform. He emphasized the importance of data-driven solutions, advocating for regular audits of police practices to identify and address disparities. The experience had a profound impact on the CEO's life and career. What began as a personal ordeal became a defining moment of purpose. He founded an organization dedicated to combating racial injustice and promoting equity in public institutions. Through this platform, he worked to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced or ignored. His team collected stories of others who had faced discrimination, using them to highlight patterns and push for change at a national level. The organization also provided resources for individuals navigating similar situations, from legal support to mental health counseling. "No one should have to go through this alone," the CEO said during a launch event. "We're here to ensure that every story is heard and every injustice is challenged." The reforms implemented in the CEO's city inspired similar efforts elsewhere. Advocacy groups in neighboring states cited his case as a blueprint for holding law enforcement accountable. State legislators introduced bills mandating body cameras, banning racial profiling, and requiring independent investigations of police misconduct. The media continued to follow the story, showcasing its far-reaching impact. For many, the CEO became a symbol of resilience and leadership in the face of adversity. His calm demeanor during the incident, coupled with his unwavering commitment to justice, resonated with people from all walks of life. Change, however, didn't come without resistance. Some within the police department viewed the reforms as an attack on their profession. Union leaders argued that the new policies undermined officers' authority and morale. But the CEO and his allies remained steadfast. "Accountability isn't anti-police," he explained during a town hall meeting. "It's about ensuring that everyone, officers and civilians alike, is treated with dignity and respect. Reform isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to build trust." Over time, some officers came to see the value in these changes. The introduction of body cameras, for example, provided protection not only for civilians, but also for officers facing false accusations. Gradually, a shift began to take root, with some officers becoming advocates for the very reforms they had once resisted. The most profound transformation occurred within the community itself. Residents who had long felt marginalized began to feel seen and heard. Neighborhood watch programs, youth mentorship initiatives, and police community dialogues flourished, creating a sense of collective responsibility for public safety. The CEO's organization played a key role in fostering these connections. By providing platforms for dialogue and collaboration, it helped break down barriers of mistrust and build a foundation for lasting change. Months after the initial incident, the community stood as a testament to the power of resilience and collective action. The CEO, once a reluctant figure in the spotlight, had become a symbol of hope and progress, not just for his city, but for countless others inspired by his journey. For the CEO, the experience was transformative on every level. He reflected on how the incident had challenged him to confront the systemic inequities he had spent his career navigating. "I used to think that success could shield me," he shared during a keynote address. "That if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, I'd be seen for who I am. But that day reminded me that no amount of success can erase the biases deeply embedded in our society. And that's why we can't just focus on individual achievements. We need to change the system itself." He credited the support of his family, colleagues, and community for helping him channel his anger and frustration into meaningful action. Their encouragement had been a source of strength during the most challenging moments, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. The changes implemented in the wake of the incident began to yield tangible results. Complaints of racial profiling decreased, trust in law enforcement grew, and community police collaboration flourished. The Independent Oversight Committee proved particularly effective, addressing grievances with transparency and fairness. Officers who demonstrated exemplary conduct were publicly recognized, fostering a culture of accountability and pride in ethical policing. The CEO's organization continued to play a pivotal role in this transformation. Through workshops, mentorship programs, and public forums, it empowered residents to become active participants in shaping their community's future. Nationally, the CEO's story became a rallying cry for systemic reform. Lawmakers introduced bipartisan legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing, inspired in part by the policies implemented in his city. Advocacy groups used his case to highlight the urgent need for accountability, citing it as evidence that change was both necessary and achievable. Media outlets revisited the story periodically, framing it as a case study in the power of grassroots activism. Documentaries, articles, and panel discussions explored the ripple effects of the incident, illustrating how one moment of injustice had sparked a movement for equity and accountability. During a widely publicized TED Talk, the CEO reflected on the journey and its lessons. He spoke of the importance of turning moments of adversity into opportunities for growth and change. "This isn't just my story," he said. "It's our story. It's about all of us choosing to see each other, not through the lens of fear or bias, but as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when we come together, speak up, and refuse to accept the status quo." He ended with a call to action, urging the audience to challenge their own biases, hold institutions accountable, and work toward a future where justice and equality were more than ideals. They were realities. As years passed, the CEO's work continued to resonate. His organization expanded its reach, partnering with other advocacy groups to address systemic inequities in education, housing, and healthcare. The city, once a flashpoint for controversy, became a model of reform. Its successes were studied and replicated by other municipalities, demonstrating the power of collective action and sustained commitment. For the CEO, the greatest reward wasn't personal accolades or public recognition. It was seeing the tangible impact of his efforts. The smiles of children growing up in a safer, more inclusive community. The stories of lives transformed by opportunities once denied. The knowledge that his experience had sparked a wave of change far greater than himself. In the final chapter of his memoir, the CEO wrote, "I used to see moments like the one I experienced as setbacks, proof of how far we still had to go. But now, I see them as turning points. They remind us of our power to shape the world we want to live in. Change is never easy, and progress is never linear. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a future where justice and equality are not just aspirations, but realities." His words resonated deeply, leaving readers with a sense of hope and empowerment. The story of the CEO's encounter with a racist cop and the transformative journey that followed became a beacon of light in a world often overshadowed by darkness. It reminded everyone that change is possible, but only if we're willing to fight for it.